and in 2014 she obtained a PhD in hydraulic engineering at the University of Naples with a research topic focusing on vertical drop shafts in sewer systems. Then she became a postdoc in University of Napoli, and then she started working at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, CMCC Foundation, where she performed research about extreme rainfall, urban flooding, soil erosion, and water resources. Today, she will talk about strategies for impact modeling in changing climate, and she will focus on the urban flooding case. So, Roberta, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. I'm sharing my screen now. Okay, can you confirm you see?
Yes.
Okay, nice. So thank you, Melissa, for this presentation, and thank you all of the board for inviting me. I have been part in the last years of the Young Professionals Network, although right now, actually, I'm not young anymore, as is the standards of the Young Professional Network. As Melissa was mentioning, I am presenting now this research topic that I concentrated on in the last years of my research career, that is some strategies for impact modeling in a changing climate, and I will give a particular focus on urban flooding. Now, just some premises. The International Panel on, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the leading EU institution in charge of climate change assessment and evaluation, has stated that basically we have to expect in the future, with a strong level of confidence, more frequent and intense extreme events, so with consequent adverse impacts and losses to nature and people. This is true, especially if we look at what happens in Europe, because basically there is a high level of confidence associated, according to the IPCC evaluations, there is a high level of confidence associated with, especially with the compound flood events coming from the overlapping of sea level rise, storm surges, and heavy rainfall events. Now, according to the suggestions of the IPCC, this in this slide shows what is called as the impact simulation chain in a climate change perspective, which is something that is the basic typical approach adopted by CMCC, and again, it is suggested by the IPCC. This chain is basically made up of different elements. The first elements concern the modeling of the climate change part, and we can see that the first element is the selection of a representative concentration pathway, the well-known RCP. RCPs are basically future scenarios, so they are assumption hypotheses about the evolution of socioeconomic condition and the concentration in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases. RCP work as a starting condition for global climate models, that are models that basically provide, they resolve the most relevant physical processes and equations, providing climate change, climate projections, so projections of climate variables such as rainfall and temperature, with a global coverage, but low horizontal and temporal resolution. So when we need more detailed information, we downscale the results of global climate models, using them as boundary condition for additional models that are the regional climate models, that basically downscale this information at higher temporal and horizontal resolutions. These features basically depend on the type of regional climate model used, but more or less we can talk about horizontal resolutions of about 10 kilometers in space and 1 day in time. The, let's say, raw results of regional climate models are typically not suitable for to be used as impact for any kind of additional further model, because they have a bias with respect to the observations. So basically what we do is an operation that is called the bias correction. That is a statistical procedure of bias removal, that makes the outputs of regional climate models suitable to be used as input. We talk, for example, about rainfall for impact models. So basically, according to the bias correction, we keep from the regional modeling only the information of what changes in the future with respect to the current climate as modeled by the climate model, and we basically apply this change to observations. The last element of this chain is, of course, the impact model tool, approach, strategy. That is the standard procedure concerning any kind of environmental impact, for example, related to hydrology, landslides, hydraulics, droughts, and so on. So in short, we can say that the first four elements make up what is called the climate change modeling component, whereas the second is the impact modeling component that basically is completely independent on the climate change part, because it is the standard procedure that we usually adopt to model any kind of desired impact. Now, here at CMCC, we have recently focused on understanding what changes when we perform a climate change modeling, the climate change modeling component before or after the impact modeling component. And so we have what we call a top-down approach when the climate change modeling is performed upstream, so before the impact modeling, and we can talk of bottom-up approaches when we perform climate change modeling downstream, so after the impact modeling. Let's see what changes. Now, this picture is, I present some generical considerations, but already focusing on the urban flooding case in terms of impact, but these considerations can be completely overlapped to any kind of physical impact that is driven somehow by climate data, by climate information. So in the right part of this panel, we have the modeling, the representation of the extreme rainfall regime. So a curve that relates return period, so frequency, with extreme rainfall depth in this case. The black curve represents the observation, so the current conditions, whereas the orange one represents the future. So instead, in the left panel, we have a green curve that represents a conceptual relationship between the climate input, in this case, the extreme rainfall depth, and an impact that we are interested on. In this case, this is the percentage of flooded area over a domain. Now, in the current conditions, we have an extreme rainfall regime that is represented by point A in the right panel, and the related impact in terms of flooding, in terms of flooded area, is represented by letter B, by point B. Now, according to the top-down approach, so we want to know, as the first term, what changes in terms of extreme rainfall when we fix, so for a fixed return period. And so we move from point A to point C. And in this case, we have an increase in the extreme rainfall depth. To understand the effect concerning the impact, we have to understand which is the impact provided by point D, which is so a different value of flooded area that can be calculated by using the new value provided by letter C of the extreme rainfall in our flood model. And so in the top-down approach, we can see that basically we are interested in understanding which is the delta change in terms of impact as a consequence of the increase, the delta change in the climate. In the same situation, but with a bottom-up approach, we are basically only interested in understanding which is the new frequency, the future frequency of, let's say, a value of impact, which is the one provided by letter B, that at present, in the current period, occurs with a different frequency. And so we are basically interested only in understanding which is the delta change in terms of frequency, so in terms of return period, so moving from point A to point C. So you can see that in this case, for example, we do not have to repeat any other flood simulation, because we can only make use of the flood simulation that performed under current climate information. To summarize, we can say that this is in this picture, I represented the very same diagrams, but with a generic frequency metric, a generic extreme climate metric, and a generic impact metric. And we can see that in the top-down approach, basically the focus is on the increase in impact due to climate change. So we want to understand which is the increase in the impact metric because of climate change. Whereas in the bottom-up approach, the focus is on the increase in the frequency of the impact because of climate change. Now I'm just showing some results that were obtained investigating a pilot area which is located in the city of Naples. So this is one of the biggest neighborhoods in the city of Naples. I do not want to give particular details about which is the tool that we used to model climate change and bias correction and flood modeling, because this is just an example of how results can be interpreted. I'm just giving some basic information. For what concerns the modeling of the climate change impact on the extreme rainfall regime, basically we have adopted an approach that we published some years ago here at CMCC, that is basically starts from the current regional WAPI model that provides any extreme rainfall depth as the product of a mean value, which is the deterministic part of the process, multiplied by a growth factor, which represents the probabilistic part of the process. And in our approach, basically, we are able to provide a new future expected extreme rainfall depth by just multiplying the observed one, so with the one provided by the WAPI, multiplied by a change factor that accounts for both changes in the deterministic part and the changes in the probabilistic part. This is instead the modeling of the flooding that we performed by using CADISCA flood tool, but again, this can be used this is just to make an example, basically. So we have some specific assumptions that I will not give particular space in this presentation about the land use, the infiltration, the position of the sewer system, and so on. This is particularly interesting when we want to perform some sort of scenario analysis. So we are just interested in comparing the results to understand the sensitivity of the model with respect to, for example, a different input rainfall. And from this simulation, we can, the software basically provides directly the information about the percentage of the domain which is flooded. Now, let's have a look at the results in terms of either both a top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. So this is the case of the top-down approach. So in the right panel, you can see the black solid curve, which is the current WAPI situation in terms of extreme rainfall. And I highlighted the two different return periods of 20 and 200 years that were used for simulations. And the gray curves represent different futures provided by different climate models. And I only highlighted basically the maximum and minimum, so the range of variation of these different future scenarios. And in the left part, in the left panel, you can see one value of impact, so in this case the percentage of flooded area for each rainfall depth. So we have a total of 10 flood simulations, so quite a lot flood simulations. And for each future scenario, we can assess an increase in the flooded area as a consequence of the increase in the extreme rainfall depth, or in this case, intensity. Instead, the same results can be interpreted by means of a bottom-up approach. So again, we can see the black solid curve on the right, which is the current situation, and I highlighted the 6 simulations concerning 6 different region periods, and you can see on the left panel the consequent flooded area indicator values. And you can see that for each of these simulations, so we are only interested in understanding which is the reduction of the return period in the rainfall input, for a total, in this case, of 6 flood simulations, because we have selected six return periods. But if we selected 2 return periods, as the previous slide, we only need 2 flood simulations. Now, let's try to summarize the pros and cons, the potentialities and limitations of these 2 different approaches in terms of different relevant features. For example, for what concerns computational burden, of course, we have seen that the bottom-up approach is the better because it only requires basically 1 flood simulation, which is interpreted then in terms of climate change, whereas the top-down approach requires a separate flood simulation for each different rainfall input. In terms of flexibility with respect to the climate change modeling, again, the bottom-up approach is the best, basically, the better between the 2, because it is completely independent. So if we, for example, change the climate projection, or we change, for example, the tool for bias adjustment, we do not have to repeat any simulation. We have only to recalculate the reduction in the frequency. Whereas, or the increase in the frequency, the change in the frequency. Whereas if we change one of these parameters for the top-down approach, we basically have as a result different input rainfall, and so we have to perform different, we have to repeat flood simulations for each of these different rainfall input. In terms of flexibility with respect to the flood modeling, the 2 approaches have the same sensitivity, because basically, if we change the flood model, we have to repeat the flood simulations again. In terms of suitability for design purpose, in this case, the top-down approach is the only one that is possible, that is suitable, because usually for design purposes, we are interested in understanding the impact, for example, the flooded area, for a certain specific rainfall input, which occurs with a specific frequency. Instead, and this is very interesting, for what concerns the suitability for communicating risks, we have found that the bottom-up approach is the best because it basically provides new frequencies for events that are already perceived as extremes under current climate. Instead, the information provided by the top-down approach, we have checked that it is less understandable in terms of communication, less effective. We can also provide a consideration with respect to the reliability or suitability of the impact curve. So the curve that is the green curve in the pictures in the slide, in the previous slides. So a curve that relates the impact to the climate driver. So we can say that if a reliable and robust impact curve exists, then the point about the computational burden is meaningless, because the computational burden will be only limited to performing a suitable number of flood simulations that allow to calibrate this curve. So for any other input, I do not need to perform different additional flood simulations, because I can extract the results directly from this impact curve. However, this curve exists only for lumped indicators, for example, the flooded area, or for example, the total runoff volume over a domain. However, when, for example, the focus of the analysis is on spatially distributed variables, for example, flood maps or hazard maps, in this case, the impact curve is a conceptual curve that it cannot be operationally represented by a curve. And so in this case, I have to account for the very different computational burden that it is required by the 2 different approaches. So in this case, when impact curve cannot be identified, modelers should rely on one approach over the other according to their specific needs. Just some conclusions. So I presented 2 different strategies that allow for the estimation of the climate change effect on urban flooding. These strategies, I labeled them as top-down and bottom-up approaches, and this label highlights the position of the climate change modeling component with respect to the flood modeling component. I showed some results about a pilot area located in the city of Naples. with my climate information consisting in intensity, duration, frequency curves, and I represented the results in terms of flooded area indicator, representing the percentage of the flooded area on the domain. But this double approach, this double strategy can be applied also with any other climate change or impact metrical tool, and it can also be exported to any kind of other impact driven by climate. The bottom-up approach typically overperforms the top-down approach just because, if you only consider the reduced number of requested flood simulations. However, the top-down approach could be the only suitable procedure when we are interested in understanding the flood metrics at specific return periods. For example, this happens when we want to use the results for design purposes. The preferability of one approach over the other ceases, so it becomes meaningless if the impacts can be inferred by a curve directly relating the impact to the input. This usually occurs for lumped indicators, for example, flooded areas. But if this is not the case, then the model should decide which approach to use according to its particular needs. This is some relevant references, and I think this is all from my side. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you, Roberta. I have a question. How did you estimate the impact on communication of the two different approaches?
Well, this is a consideration. This is a very, very interesting question, actually. We have this perception, not by this particular research, let's say, but interacting with authorities and municipalities in charge of this kind of evaluation. So institutions that should use this kind of evaluation in their management. And we saw that it was very difficult to make the effect of climate change evident when we provided, for example, the increase in the extreme rainfall. Whereas if we if we provided information about, for example, a rainfall value that is now occurring on average once every 100 years, and in the future it will occur on average once every 50 years. This we found that was much more comprehensible by the people that should use this kind of results.
That's interesting, because I would have thought the contrary, actually.
It is not, because this was also interesting for me, because I had a similar perception with respect to you. I was also convinced that the right way was to fix the return periods and provide new extreme rainfalls, but instead it was very interesting to understand that it is not.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? Okay. If not, I have another one. Yeah, just a curiosity, but are authorities already using one of these approaches, both known?
I don't think they are using it right now, because my perception is that it is only now that this kind of authorities, but also in general, water managers in general, are now confronting with they are asked basically to integrate this kind of evaluations in their typical operations. And my perception is that they are now trying to understand who to rely to, which tool to rely to. But so right now I am not aware, in Italy at least, of any manager that is already using this kind of approach, but they are organizing right now, basically.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if there are no other questions, I think we can close this presentation. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Roberta. And see you for our next coffee break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Roberta. Bye-bye.
Bye.